Okay, well, I told the group last night, let me begin by defining an argument that I've been using for the resurrection now for, well, I did it in my doctoral dissertation, so that was light years ago. Most of you weren't born. Seriously, this was like 1975. And on my committee at a secular school, Michigan State, I always have to think about where I am to see if I'm in a part of the woods where people can't stand Michigan State. There's a natural rivalry, like if I said Mississippi or Mississippi State or LSU or whoever LSU's number one rival is. So you have to be careful that you're not going to be lynched or something. But about half my committee thought there was something to the resurrection, and about half my committee thought there definitely wasn't. That never occurred. But my advisor early on, the director, I should say, of my program, said basically, he said, we're liberal here. But he said, we're good liberal. And I thought, what's good liberal? And he said, we don't care what you do for your dissertation if it's approved by the group. We may not agree with you, but if you can defend it, we will approve it. So we don't care if we agree with you or not. Just know how to argue. That's what a PhD should teach you. So I started working. And I learned a lot of things real early on. Here's a couple things I learned. When you're talking to non-specialists, the Jesus mythers, the people who say, the growing number who say Jesus never lived, I often characterize them as the guys who still live at home with their parents, they blog in the basement, and they like to tell you they're published because they have a blog. And they're specialists in something. Well, you'll get this when they come up to you in state universities. I'm a specialist in ancient history. And I want to say to them, yeah, I'm sure you are at 18. I'm sure you got this down. One guy said he was an expert in ancient languages. I thought, okay, we've got a guy in our faculty who's an expert in ancient languages. And I feel like saying to them, how do you do in hieroglyphics? How are you in Akkadian, Chaldean? You pretty good with those? You know, the way people throw comments around about being specialists in this or that, and they set themselves up as being real scholars, and then when you start to do a resurrection argument, they may say, I see what you're doing right away. You're using the New Testament. Can't use the New Testament. That's circular reasoning, to use your own source. And you can tell right away they're not up on data and how critics argue and who the guys are at the state universities who don't agree with you, but who will let you through the program as long as you can defend your thesis. Let's take Bart Ehrman. Bart Ehrman calls himself an agnostic leaning toward atheism. He says, I am not a Christian. I don't care to promote Christianity. I'm just telling you where the data are. That's how he starts his book, Did Jesus Exist? And he goes after the guys, the bloggers, the guys who aren't published, the self-made experts who do not know what they're talking about. And they just talk. And they talk to each other. And so they say little things like, you can't use the New Testament. And as I tell my grad students, when you talk to a Bart Ehrman, you'd better know how to use the New Testament critically, because if you don't cite the New Testament, they will. And they will cite it more than we will cite it. But they know what they're doing, according to their own methodology. Now, I don't know if this is true. I do not know. Somebody can come up and tell me later whether this is a myth or whether it's really true. But I've heard that when spiders spin webs, they know which strands they can walk across and not get caught on, and which ones they can't step on, or they'll be caught in their own trap. And that's kind of what I'm talking about here. When you deal with critical scholars, you've got to know what strands to walk on in the New Testament. You have to have some basis for what they think is reliable. Now, true, it depends on where the ethos of New Testament thought is today, where critical scholars are today. And if you've got to walk on the strands that you're not going to get caught on, you have to know where those strands are and what they are. So let me start with a few parameters that I'm going to use in the lecture today. First of all, as I told the group last night, Bart Ehrman and his friends, and by the way, I've been told, now this is not official, but I've been told that Bart Ehrman now calls himself an atheist New Testament scholar. What strands does he walk on? Okay, here's one of the most important strands. There's 13 books in the New Testament that bear Paul's name. 7 of them you may use. You can walk on the strands. Does anybody know, is that a true story about spiders or not? Does anyone know? You've heard that too? They can walk on. It's a really good illustration. And if you're going to go to a state university, you're going to do a PhD, you've got to do things the way they do things. And they'll even tell you sometimes. A friend of mine was doing a degree, and they said to him, he was trying to do his dissertation and do some preaching type alliteration and have all the chapters start with the letter B or something like that. And the professor just said to him one day, he said, "You're not in your little fundamentalist classes anymore. You're in a state university. Shape up. Learn the way to do this. We want you to be a scholar. We don't care if you agree with us, but when you get out of here, you got to be a scholar." So I like that spider thing because they know their way around. Now, way around for Paul would be to use one of the 13 epistles that they think Paul wrote. And I say they think Paul wrote. You can get the best New Testament introductions from critical viewpoint. Line them up side by side on your shelf, like Luke Timothy Johnson's, Helmut Kirster's, of course Bart Ehrman's, Thiessen's. A lot of these guys have New Testament intros that you can take and you can read. And here's what you're going to find when you get to Paul. It'll say, Bart Ehrman calls these 7 Pauline epistles the undisputed Pauline texts. Undisputed, or unanimously accepted. What does that mean? First of all, what are they? The 7 epistles are, and by the way, if you're a pastor and you're preaching through Paul, there's the 7 epistles that you will probably most likely use. They'll be your favorite ones. They're granted. Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1 Thessalonians, Philemon. Again, Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1 Thessalonians, and Philemon. For theological reasons, talk to Dr. Stewart or some of your other profs. These are the key books for setting up Christian theology and Christian history. The meetings between Paul and Peter and James in Galatians 1, and Paul and Peter, James, and John in 2 are extremely important meetings, because maybe, apologetically speaking, maybe the best thing Paul, you could argue, the best thing Paul bequeathed to us is knowing the other apostles and telling us what they thought. We have that from Paul. Now, who do the critics think Paul is? He's authoritative. What does authoritative mean? Well, he's the author of these 7 books. One really neat thing about it is critics always take the same 7 books. Now, some of them might add. The G.A. Wells, the Jesus mythicist, he'll add Colossians. So now you have 8. But he doesn't subtract Galatians. Everybody gives you the 7. and somebody will throw in Ephesians or Colossians, nobody gives you the pastoral epistles. That's another. They think the pastoral epistles were written probably about 100 AD by somebody else, claiming to be Paul. And you go, well, that's not what I think. That's not what we teach at NOBTS. Well, you could say, but if you're doing your PhD at LSU, say you're not at NOBTS, or you're not at Liberty. You're either going to do the dissertation by their standards, or you're not getting out, because they want to know you're a scholar. So, now what does it mean to be authoritative? All right, so you got 7 books by Paul. What does it mean to be authoritative? Do you mean he's inspired? No, don't even use that word. There's not a concept called inspiration. But, okay, that's the bad news from these guys. Paul's not inspired. Okay, what's the good news? Paul's authoritative. He studied under the best people. According to the book of Acts, he studied under Gamaliel. Now, for you philosophy students, that would be maybe similar today, seriously, to you taking a PhD under Alvin Plantinga. There are certain people that if you study under them, you'll get a lot of acclaim because of who your head professor is. Bart Ehrman studied under the great Bruce Metzger at Princeton Theological Seminary. And Bruce Metzger, probably without much doubt, was the #1 Greek scholar of his time. And they were very close friends, and they liked each other a lot, even though, as Bart says, we were at opposite ends of the scale. Bruce Metzger was Orthodox. In fact, I've seen a copy of his application to the Evangelical Theological Society where you have to agree. This is before they added the Trinity. You had to agree to inerrancy, and he signed it. So to study under these guys, that's the kind of thing people remember. You know, when I went to school, everybody knew who Rudolf Bultmann's disciples were. All right, according to Acts, Paul studied under Gamaliel. All right, so he's sharp. He's a scholar. He studied under the top fella. He knows what the Old Testament is. All right, so he's got that kind of background. He's sharp. He's trained. He knows the Old Testament. What else? Well, they'll tell you, Paul could be mistaken. That's the critical view. Paul could be mistaken, but Paul wouldn't lie to you. He's honest. Well, how do you know Paul's honest? How would you know Paul's honest? Well, look at his ethics. He was willing to die for his faith. Everyone concedes that. What does that tell you? That tells you that Paul thought he was presenting the truth. He believed he was Jesus' messenger. He believed he met the risen Jesus on the way to Damascus. Michael Martin, before he passed away, famous atheist philosopher, said, we only have one eyewitness testimony to a resurrection appearance. See, because most critics, Bart Ehrman included, do not think they think the 4 Gospels are anonymous books. We don't know the author. But we do know the author of these 7 epistles, and it's Paul. So that's very high in their list of what's accredited information. And maybe, like I said, the best thing Paul gave us was that he knew Peter and James, Galatians 1, Peter, James, and John, Galatians 2. And they're the big 4. No one is more influential in the early church than Paul, Peter, James, the brother of Jesus, and John. And Paul knew them. And so when Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 15:11, after talking about the other apostles and the appearances of Jesus, when he says, whether it is I or whether it is them, so we preach, and so you believe. When he tells you that the other apostles believe the same thing he does about seeing the risen Jesus, that's not even a full step removed from the eyewitnesses. That's like a half step. It only requires that Paul knew them and that he was correct about their beliefs. And critics tend to think Paul was right. They hold Paul in very high esteem. So, first principle to learn before I go introduce this list of arguments is what strands you can walk on the web. And you can always use the 7 authentic epistles of Paul. Now, you can quote a verse. Now, a critic might say to you, yeah, I think you're wrong about your argument on that verse. Well, you'd have to discuss it. But the point is, it was still written by Paul. He still has all that authority behind him. And you can disagree what he means. What does he mean by free will? What does he mean by sovereignty? You know, you can get into some really detailed things here. But do you have a basis to be talking like that? And the answer is yes. He's a first-rate scholar, and you can quote the New Testament with these guys, but know what strand you're walking on. Okay, second point. The New Testament scholarship has moved to the right in the last few decades. Why? Some things are going on that cause critics to come face to face with supernatural New Testament claims like Jesus was a miracle worker, Jesus was raised from the dead. When I went to graduate school, if you believed the tomb was empty, a kind professor might say to you, would you either be evangelical or a conservative Catholic? And that professor would be right most of the time, because it was a minority view held by conservative Catholics and evangelicals. There was an empty tomb. But almost nobody thought you could get there as an argument, because there's no steps to get to that argument. It's hanging out there in space, and we can't fill it in with data. Why? Well, when I went to school, Rudolf Bultmann, as one guy said toward the end of their lives, Bultmann died in 1976. One guy said, Bultmann is king. Bultmann was far more influential in that generation, the 60s and the 70s. Bultmann was far more evidential than anybody writing today, I would say. Way more influential than a Bart Ehrman or others. And in his famous 1941 essay, New Testament and Christology, New Testament and mythology, which changed New Testament scholarship toward a mythical basis, here's how he starts a section called The Resurrection. First sentence, what can we say about the resurrection of Jesus? Question mark. Is it not a myth, pure and simple? Question mark. That's how you start. What do you say about the resurrection? It's a myth. What else do you want? And then when you try to follow it up the way you're used to following it up, the way evangelicals do, well, Dr. Bultmann, can we talk about history? No. Why? Because history has nothing to do with faith. Faith is separate. This is Bultmann. Faith is separate. It's ungrounded. Apologetics, that's like a cuss word. You don't try to do evidences. You don't ask God what, if you believe in him, you don't ask God what the evidences for him speaking are. You either believe or you don't believe. Faith stands on its own. It's self-authenticating. You don't do evidences. Go, oh no. How do I get to the empty tomb? You don't. Well, what can I say? You can say it's taught in the New Testament. Is it historically true? No. What else do you want to know? All right. So almost nobody believed in the empty tomb. Almost nobody believed that Jesus was the Son of God. And virtually nobody believed Jesus was a miracle worker. Now it's recorded in the Gospels, but so was it said about Hercules and Alexander the Great and a host of other figures. And this is how the ancients talked. They just believed things. And you can say you did your PhD under Alvin Plantinga. They can say their well-known people are the son of Hercules, the son of Zeus. There's a pedigree for you. Is that true? No. But they claim it. Romulus and Remus, founders of Rome, sons of the gods. So why is it special to be the son of God? Well, today we don't reason like this. We allow reasons for things, and reasons are in. And you can sit down and do a dissertation, I assume, under Bart Ehrman, and have reasons for what you believe, and you play by the rules, you know where the strands are, and you can do it. What are the strands? What happened today? To use my illustration, Jesus is a miracle worker. Yep. Well, how many people believed it when I went to school? Almost none. Evangelicals and conservative Catholics. That's about it. 25%. Because evangelicals and conservative Catholics didn't go to school in those days. We taught our stuff, but we were separate from the rest of the world. Today, we try to mesh and try to, have good reasons for what we teach. Today, it's almost unanimous that Jesus was a miracle worker. Now, what are his miracles? They're usually divided into three categories by critics: healing miracles, exorcisms, and nature miracles. Now, evangelicals don't normally call exorcisms miracles, but critics do. Okay, I won't argue. They are supernatural. Okay, healing, exorcisms, and nature miracles. The most disputed ones are the nature miracles. But almost everybody believes Jesus is a miracle worker. Marcus Borg, he passed away now, but co-founder of the Jesus Seminar, said, "You may not like miracles, but on historical grounds, it is almost impossible to dispute them." Really? Yeah. How many believed when Boltmann was king? Almost none. How many believe today? Almost everyone. Why? Because there's good arguments for it. And Marcus Borg gives three good arguments for miracles. Here's two of them, and listen closely because I'm going to be using these today. These are called New Testament criteria. Now, there's a big dispute today. You could do a whole doctoral dissertation on the use of criteria in the New Testament. You've heard your professors use them. But criteria, how do we admit a certain saying or a certain event? Well, because there's enemy attestation. Because, all right, somebody told me, does anybody know what the most cited reason is for why there was an empty tomb? This is easily the most cited historical reason for the empty tomb. No, I mean, what's the best evidence for the empty tomb? We believe it because, why would you say it's a good argument? Because, you're right, things like that they stole the body don't work. Who? Who did? Okay, so that's, okay, if the priest in book of Matthew, if they tried to cover it up, that's called enemy attestation, right? Even the enemies, just the way you'd say it, even the enemies thought the tomb was empty. All right, I'm still waiting for by far the best known one. What do you do about the appearances? And I'll be saying that today. The appearances would seem to involve something about the tomb. If Jesus appeared ethereally, what I tell my PhD students is what I call the Jedi Jesus view. You know what Jedi Jesus is? I'm not a fan of Star Wars. I mean, I go to see them, but I just got over a week ago, got over the flu, and unfortunately, I'm fine, but laryngitis remains. And if you'll excuse me taking one of these lemon things, and whichever one it was, which is the one with the little tiny bears in it? The what? Return of the Jedi. Remember at the end how Luke looks across the campfire and he sees Darth Vader, who had a deathbed conversion. Notice how you can say it in religious terms. Deathbed conversion, Obi-Wan, and the little munchkin, Yoda. Okay, I have backed this thing up over and over and over. You have to look real carefully, but it looks like Luke can see right through them and see the trees and the landscape through them. So it's, in philosophical terms, these are rather Platonic. They're disembodied, real appearances, right? They're really there. They lead you to believe in the movie. They're really present. Secondly, they're interacting with Luke, so they're personal. How do you know? Because they look at Luke and they smile, sort of like, well done, son. You've done well. I trained you, Obi-Wan would say. I trained you, Yoda would say. And then what do you do when you see your father, Darth Vader, young, and he's very happy with where you've come? All right, that's Jedi Jesus. And in the 60s and 70s, it was the most popular view going, that Jesus appeared just like that. And you could see through him. He was disembodied. So what happens when you go down to the empty tomb? There should be a body inside the tomb, because ethereal appearances do not depend on a flesh and blood body. But now, if Jesus appears the way the Gospels say, and you can't see through him, and if you shake hands with him, he's got a firm handshake, and if you put him on scales, he weighs something, is the tomb going to be empty? Will the tomb be empty if Jesus appears as a flesh and blood body? Yeah, the tomb should be empty. So that figures in. I'm still waiting for by far the number one reason. The biggest argument for the empty tomb is the testimony of the women. I'm just giving you an example of how you argue like a critic. I'm giving you an example of knowing what strands to walk on. Now, someone's going to blow this whole story up and say that's not true of spiders, and then I'm not going to have my illustration anymore. But why is it important that the women are the witnesses? Let me tell you what. The Gospels were not written by four guys in four carousels in your library where they could look over and go, hey, that saying about love God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind. Is it heart, soul, strength, and mind, or heart, soul, mind, and strength? It's mind and strength. Thanks. Mind and strength. They weren't sitting there in four carousels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, writing out their Gospels. They're in different places of the Mediterranean, telling their story. Why do the women always turn out being the first and primary witnesses? Think about this. Remember, Jesus said the last will be first, the first will be last? Why is it the women at the cross, when the men ran away, almost all of them? Why is it the women at the burial, with two barely known disciples, Joseph and Nicodemus, doing the burying? Why are the women the first ones to the tomb? And why are they the first ones to see Jesus? That makes a good sermon, doesn't it? That's for Mother's Day. See, you can tell women that they had an important place in the early church, even if they were put down sociologically. Theologically, they were among the chief witnesses. And they always appear in the list of, like, Acts 1, who was present when Jesus ascended and so on. All right, the fact that the women went there, you write four Gospels in four different locations around the Mediterranean, and all four of them say the women were the first ones to go. Guess what? The women were the first ones to go. Why? Well, you tell me something. If you're writing an apologetic and you want people to become Christians, why do you make your chief witnesses women? Horrible move. Why? Nobody will listen to you. Why? Well, the Talmud says women are liars. The Talmud also says men are liars, but you're not using your best sources. Excuse me, folks. Even if the women were the first witnesses, why not tell the story like this? And then Peter and John went to the tomb early Sunday morning. Why not hook into that second appearance to the males? Because more people will listen to you. Why do they tell the story the way they do? Here's the reason. Because it's true. They tell it that way because it's true. So now critics, when they give you reasons to believe in the empty tomb, you cite the women. That's called embarrassment. That's the principle of embarrassment. When the Jewish leaders play the guards, that's the principle of enemy attestation. The favorite, probably for most people, is multiple attestation. It's the two heads are better than one rule. Critics divide the Gospels into 5 different sources. You can use this, learn this in your New Testament class. There are variations, but you've got Mark, was the earliest, and those of you who weren't here last night, a dating has been announced for that Mark fragment, and it's been dated 80 to 110 AD. It's the earliest New Testament fragment we have. And if you buy the thesis, it's not unanimously held, but if you buy the thesis that Mark was the earliest gospel, Mark is a source. Now, I try to trick my grad students, and I'll say, all right, the feeding of the 5,000 is told in all 4 Gospels. Besides the resurrection, it's the only miracle told in all 4 Gospels. How many sources do you have? If you have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, what is your source count? Does anybody know critically? You've already gone through New Testament at grad level. How many sources do you have? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. What's the source count? What number do you have? Thanks, Bob. Pardon? Well, if you're going to have those 4 Gospels, I guess you'd have to count Q. What are your 4? Mark. John. Q. M and L. You got 5. Now, you could say, well, this is an evangelical school. We don't believe in Q, M, and L. No, you do. No, you don't. The professors don't like it. Okay, look. They have their views on whether Q is a separate lost document, but they don't deny, I don't think any of your professors deny, that what is called Q refers to a number of verses that are in Matthew and Luke that are not in Mark. If all I say is, we're going to call Q those verses that are commonly held by Matthew, Mark, Matthew and Luke, but not in Mark, we're simply going to call those verses Q, but they're right there in your New Testament. What's M? M are the verses that Matthew has alone. L are the verses Luke has alone. Well, I don't believe in all that sort of stuff. But you believe that Luke has verses that nobody else has. Yes, thank you. So we can do this too. We can walk on the right strands. But there's 5 sources there in the Gospels. John is separate. So you got Mark, you got John. All right, now a trick question or two. If it's in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, how many sources do you have? If it's in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you count. How many do you have? 1. Because theoretically, if you take the most common view, Matthew and Luke used Mark. Mark's their source. 1, Mark. What if it's in Mark and Matthew? How many sources do you have? 1. What if it's in Mark and John? How many sources do you have? 2. You see how it works? I hate to say you're playing the game the way the critics are playing the game, but if you're going to do a PhD at their institution, you have to learn how to walk on the strands. And out of 4 Gospels, you can get 5 sources. Once again, Mark, John are separate. Matthew alone, Luke alone, and the verses that are in Matthew and Luke, but they're not in Mark. And I don't care whether you believe MLQ theories, but if you're going to do the argument the way they argue, all you're doing is picking out verses that are already in your text and calling them certain things. That's all you're doing. So that's a second move. We're going to be using criteria like enemy attestation, embarrassment. Think of all the embarrassment things. The brother of Jesus didn't believe in him. Do you know Mark 3? We don't say this, but Mark 3, when Jesus' family, when they tried to get Jesus out of the way and they thought he was mentally ill, that's what the Greek says. They thought he was beside himself. You know what it says? His mother and his family. Mother, yes, I'm just telling you what the text says. Did she believe? That's a hard question. If she's a normal mother, she's probably hearing these incredible things and she doesn't know where to go. And she's taking some with a grain of salt and believing some others. Or maybe she's an exception and she believed, but none of the rest of them did. We don't know. But mother is included there in Mark 3. By the way, we have a backup. Why? Because John 7 tells us that James didn't believe. So now you have two sources. That's multiple attestation. John and Mark are two. But Matthew and Mark are one. All right, so number two, the criterion. How do we argue the way the critics do? And number three, early creeds. This may be the most important argument of all. Critics are unanimous today that in the New Testament there are dozens of early creedal texts, and it's maybe the most exciting New Testament question there is. I think it is. Here's the question. Of what did the earliest preaching consist before a single New Testament book was penned? Let me ask that again. Of what did earliest preaching consist before there was a single book? Before you could say, well, Romans chapter 3 says, well, first of all the chapters and verses were added later. Yeah, it's like the fifth chapter, it's like the fifth paragraph down in my copy. Yeah, well, I don't have your copy. Different people copy it. How do you communicate? Well, it's in Romans. Believe me, it's in Romans. And you're quoting something. How do you compare these texts in the ancient world? What about when there was no Romans? What about 30 to 50 when there was, I don't know, some people say Galatians may have been in there. Some people say 1 Thessalonians may have been in there. But let's just say for the sake of the argument there are no books. Or there were two books, but you live in a part of the Mediterranean, you never seen them. What did you do for 20 years? You cited oral teachings. How do you know? Over and over and over. The New Testament says, observe the traditions of the elders. That was one way. Twice in 1 Corinthians, actually three times, 1 Corinthians, but twice very clearly Paul says, I gave you what I was given. Guess what Josephus tells us? That the Pharisees taught by passing on tradition. What was Paul doing? Passing on tradition. Why do you think he would do that? He was a Pharisee. See how you can put these arguments together? And it's very important that Paul got this from somebody else. That means there's a chain. And when Paul says, 1 Corinthians 15:11, whether it's I or they, so we preach and so you believe. I don't care if you go to me, if you go to Peter, if you go to James, you're going to hear the same thing about the resurrection and appearance of Jesus. Oh, what did he look like? Could you see through him? Was he a Jedi Jesus? No, he wasn't. He was solid, just like me talking to you. See, and it's that chain that allows you to answer these questions. And Paul was very careful to observe that chain. Observe the tradition of the elders. Why would he be? He was trained to do that. He was a Pharisee, and he was probably the best of the best. That's why he was the one that was nominated to be persecutor of the church. He was very good at what he did. You might call him a scholar athlete. He not only knew the Old Testament and took his PhD under Gamaliel, but he had to be in pretty good shape to go from house to house and grab these guys. Some of them pretty physical. Now, he might have had some soldiers with him. But, I mean, he did a lot of walking, and there are probably some pretty rough times. And so Paul's a pretty unique person. Okay. So we have dozens of these creeds in the New Testament, and the critics, interestingly, agree where they are and what they tell us. We're getting ready to teach a course this next summer, a PhD course, a summer topics course where we change topics. And I'm, for the first time, teaching a course on an historical look at the early creeds. What are the creedal passages in the New Testament, and what do they tell us historically? Why are they important historically? Okay, with all that background, the accepted New Testament books, at the head of the list would be the 7 Pauline epistles. Number 2, using the criteria, embarrassment, women, testimony to the tomb, etc., and the early creeds. I give 6 facts for the minimal facts for the resurrection. And here's the way I argue. The minimal facts argument that I started developing for the PhD and developed later goes like this. I'm only going to use data that fulfill 2 criteria. I'm playing their game. It's sort of like saying, do you believe in M and L and Q? And you could say, no, but I believe those verses are there. It's sort of like that. You're going to use what's already in the New Testament, but you're going to configure the arguments the way critics configure their arguments. But you already have the verses. Okay, by far the most common reason to believe these, I'm going to give 6. I give different numbers because nobody gives you only these few facts. They give you more. I'm going to use 6. And the first criteria is I will use no fact that is not backed up by a plethora of other facts. So if I say there's good reason to believe Jesus died by crucifixion, it's my very first one, I'm going to give you about a dozen reasons to believe the crucifixion. But I'm going to have to go through this very quickly. I have a total of 60-some arguments for just 6 verses. And this is why, the second point, this is why nobody argues. The minimal facts are the best attested facts in the New Testament. And as a result, because there are many arguments that come in on each one, nobody argues with you. Now I'm playing their game, and once again, their game, use their sources, use their criteria, and make use of the early creeds that predate the New Testament itself. Bart Ehrman called these pre-Pauline creeds. And here's, as I told the group last night, if you were here, here's what pre-Pauline means. Jesus died approximately 30 AD. Paul comes to Jesus approximately 32 or 33. Pre-Pauline means when Paul came to Christ, these creeds were already in existence. That's how early they are. Also help you with things like, well, was Paul the founder of Christianity? Was Jesus a Palestinian prophet who minded his own business and said, turn the other cheek and taught some really good principles? And is Paul the founder, the culprit, who made Christianity to a Hellenistic religion? Really? That was commonly taught 120 years ago, not today. Virtually nobody will say that. Why not? Well, one of the reasons is because when Paul came to Christ, there were dozens of these creedal statements with very high Christology. And I love Richard Bauckham's one-liner. The earliest Christology is the highest Christology. So many people say that Jesus' teaching was so dense it had to be unpacked. He dies in 30-ish AD, but nobody really unpacked what he was saying until John said it 65 years later. It took him that long to unpack things like incarnation and deity. Bauckham used to hold that view. I remember the day he told me this personally. By the way, Jimmy Dunn had a conversation with him years ago. He held this view. Almost everybody held this view, that the church didn't come around to recognizing who Jesus was for about 60 years. It took them that long to unpack it. Now it's totally flip-flopped. And Larry Hurtado, Bauckham, Jimmy Dunn, they all think that coming out of the gates, in 30 AD, coming out of the gates, something jettisoned the message of Christianity into the Roman world. All right, with that background, I'm arguing the way they argue, i.e., I am walking on their strands. I sure hope that's right about the spiders. All right, fact number 1, how do we know Jesus died by crucifixion? Now, I'm going to go through these quickly, but I'm assuming this background I've already told you. Correct sources, criteria, arguments for acceptance, and early creeds. All right. Medical information, death by crucifixion. You know, of all the ways Jesus could have died, it's still said, there are other views, but it's by far the predominant view, is that death by crucifixion is death by asphyxiation. Every once in a while, somebody's messing around with somebody, a hazing incident, a sorority or fraternity or whatever, and someone dies. One time they left a person tied to monkey bars, and they found him dead the next day. I got a call one time from a guy who said, I am probably the leading expert in America on tree stand deaths. How many of you hunt? How many of you hunt in tree stands? Watch out, you might die. And no one's got to shoot you. You got a choice. Put your strap on or don't put it on. You don't put it on, you fall out of the tree. You have a high percentage of being totally crippled for the rest of your life. But if you do put it on, the guy told me on the phone, here's what happens. The guy falls out of the tree. He's got a strap on. It goes up underneath his arms. It pulls his arms up like this. He's hanging from the side of the tree like this. And they find the side of the tree stripped of bark as he frantically tries to get back up into the blind. And he's dead. And the guy called me and he said, what just happened to him? I said, what the heck are you calling me for? Because you're supposed to be the guy with crucifixion, and someone told me they're similar. Hang a person in this position, and they're going to die. It's the predominant view, because when the weight of the body hangs down. Where I'm going with this is, you don't have to have a Johns Hopkins medical degree to have been at the side of the cross. Hang the person up like that. And go away if you want to. As long as nobody takes him down, he's going to asphyxiate. Now, people are quick to say, Josephus tells the case of 3 people who got down off the cross alive. Yes, he does, in his autobiography. What's the story behind that? He's walking around where Titus is sieging Jerusalem. He finds 3 of his friends crucified. He begs to have them taken down. The Romans grant it. The 3 friends are taken down, and 2 of them die anyway. That's how rough crucifixion was. My point is, you don't have to have a medical degree. Asphyxiation. We have early sources that say that it was common to give a death blow to somebody who's on the cross. You're not getting down on my watch. And one guy had his skull crushed with a club. One guy's threatened with a bow and arrow. Sometimes they smashed ankles. Well, why would you smash ankles? Because the person can't pull back up again. And they asphyxiate. I don't know what you think about the Shroud. I've co-authored a couple books on it with one of the guys who did the 1978 investigation. It's looking like it might be the real thing. But be that as it may, this isn't the place to debate it, but the man buried in the Shroud is dead. Dead, dead, dead. How do you know? Well, he's in a state of rigor mortis. That's kind of hard to fake. He's got postmortem blood flow. He's got separation of blood and serum. He's dead. So if the Shroud is Jesus' knockout punch. All right, now I'm going to start arguing the way I just told you. Use good sources, use good rules, and use the creeds. 20 pre-Pauline creedal sources for the death of Jesus. Now, I don't know how you'd prove all of them are pre-Pauline. I'm only doing what the critics say. They say these are pre-Pauline. Someone needs to do the doctoral dissertation on this subject. Is there any way to tell, is there a strata? Is there any way to tell which of these sources are the earliest? And how do we know which ones are pre-Pauline? That'd be a very important contribution. But 20 pre-Pauline sources. A half dozen major canonical texts. It is not true that, like the bloggers in the basement say, you can't use the New Testament. New Testament scholars, you'll never find a New Testament scholar say that. Rudolf Bultmann wouldn't say that. Just know what strands to walk on. Use what sources are good. Don't use your favorite ones if you can't back them up. Here's some of the criteria. Enemy attestation, women, multiple attestation. Multiple attestation, 48 sources for the crucifixion of Jesus. Bart Ehrman says we have 15 sources, the way he counts, 15 sources within 100 years. Folks, in ancient history, that's incredible. This is multiple attestation, very important. Now, I don't think multiple literary forms is important, but the critics count different forms. This comes from Bultmann. And you have parables, miracles, creeds, teaching, and apocalyptic, all of which talk about Jesus' death. You go, apocalyptic? Yeah, what about Revelation, where he said every eye will see him, even those who pierced him? It's a reference to crucifixion, of course. Embarrassing testimony. They killed slaves this way. Jesus was beat up. He would have been the best debater in the universe, but he wasn't allowed to talk. But that'd be hard on me. How could somebody accuse you and you don't even answer? He may have been crucified nude. It's possible. In fact, some people say it's likely. Very embarrassing. Here's 3 more. Now notice what I'm doing is the A, B, C, D go according to categories. The numbers give you separate arguments. So there's Aramaic, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, from the cross. Scholars think that Aramaic gives you insight into what may be the verba obsissima of Jesus, his exact words. Rejection, execution, that's not as well accepted, but this is John Myers. Why did he die is a criteria. Coherence, what's coherence? Well, they always killed the prophets in the Old Testament. It's no wonder that they killed Jesus. Number 2, this is the most important one. The disciples had experiences that they believed to be appearances of the risen Jesus. Notice the way I word that. Critics allow that wording. They may disbelieve the resurrection, but they will allow that wording. The disciples had real experiences, yes. They believed that they saw Jesus, yes. You know what Bart Ehrman says about this? Why wouldn't I admit that? He said that's solid history. We have backup for it. What kind of backup? 8 pre-Pauline creeds. I'm only counting that as just one argument, by the way. As one of you already said this morning, the fact that the tomb was empty, gives credence to the disciples' claim to have seen Jesus. By the way, I don't use empty tomb as one of my 6 facts because it's not unanimous among scholars. I said when I was in grad school, maybe 25% of people believed it. Now it's about 75% if you do the head count. I only accept facts that are up in the 90s, 90 percentile, so it's not so well accepted. But it being accepted as the lesser of the 2 criterion, the more important criterion is a lot of evidences. Probably no early fact concerning the death, burial, resurrection of Jesus has as much data as the empty tomb. I gave a paper at ETS a few years ago, 22 reasons to accept the empty tomb. 22 historical evidences. How many do you need? Marcus Borg gives 3 for Jesus being a miracle worker. By the way, you know what 2 of his 3 are? Multiple attestation. Remember I told you 5 out of 5 gospel sources? How many report Jesus being a miracle worker? All 5. That's heavy evidence. And you're doing it the way that you're just walking on the right strands. 5 sources, all 5 say Jesus was a miracle worker. Even Q. Why do I say even Q? Because Q is a sayings document, not a doing document, and it still has the miracles of Jesus recorded. It has the incident where John sends his disciples and says, are you the Messiah? Should we look for somebody else? And Jesus sends the word back, look at the miracles I'm doing. And it recounts the miracles. That's in Matthew and Luke and not in Mark. However you count that, it's in Matthew and Luke and not in Mark. Now, if you take the Griesbach hypothesis or something else, you'll take a different form, but it's still in Matthew and Luke and not in Mark. So, 22 evidences for the empty tomb. Folks, we don't have this kind of data in the ancient world. Give me 22 arguments for anything in Alexander's life. Go for it. Do a PhD in history and do 22 evidences for Alexander the Great fighting against the Persians using the phalanx. Oh, and by the way, you've got to jump through the right hoops. These have to be early sources. They've got to be within 100 years. They've got to be... Now you see where I'm going? Now give me 22 of them. That's what we have for the empty tomb. If the tomb's empty, that's an argument for the appearances. Here's some more criteria for disciples' experiences. 10 different sources within 100 years say the disciples saw the risen Jesus. You know how heavy this is? The Jesus Seminar and John Dominic Crossan, I don't remember the exact numbers, but they both say we have multiple attestation for group appearances. You know why group appearances are important? For people who tell you it could have been an hallucination. Luke could have imagined seeing Obi-Wan, Darth Vader, and who did I leave out? Yoda. But notice when his twin sister runs up and gives him a hug, she doesn't seem to see them. Could be an hallucination. Not if she wasn't looking in the right direction, but there were 5 people standing with Luke, and all of them saw the 3 characters around the fire. That's not an hallucination. Some of you know that next to the resurrection, the topic I spend the most time with is near-death experiences, for opening up the supernatural world against people who say there's no Narnia. I often start my lecture on near-death experiences and say, how many of you wish there was a Narnia? Well, there is. The latest book on near-death experiences say that 9 to 20 million Americans have had them. You may have not had a visit there, but millions of Americans have. What are you going to do with this? Well, some of the NDE accounts, one in particular, 5 people in a room, 5 healthy people, saw the phenomena that were manifested in that room when their grandmother/mother, depending on who the 5 people were, when they saw what looked like a spirit come out of her body still laying back on the pillow, and they watch her go down this tunnel, and they watch her as far as they can, and they all see the glow, and there's 5 of them. What if 5 people saw Obi-Wan? You get the point. And the Jesus Seminar and Bart Ehrman say that we have multiple sources for group appearances. Very, very evidentially important. Multiple forms. I already told you, I think B3 is a much stronger argument than B4. But critics like B4, so I'm going to play their game. Embarrassment. Why did you make women the first witnesses? Because they were. Next question. It's a good comeback. By far the most common reason the critics give for an empty tomb. Enemy attestation, notice there's 2 there, B6 and B7. Enemy attestation and Aramaic. Group appearances. Variety. Different people, both genders, different times, different locations, different events. That's important. Because some people are prone, they're wired. Dom Crossan says we're all hardwired to see visions. Okay. But he is right that different people are more prone to see certain things than others. So the fact that there are both genders, different times, locations, and events, very important. 14 group appearances. This includes repeats. So if Luke says all the disciples saw him and John says all the disciples saw him, that's a 2 count, but it's the same event, okay? Reported at 5 different sources. Paul takes 2 trips to Jerusalem and confirmed the gospel message. The gospel message includes the resurrection appearances. The The apostles preach the same message as Paul says, and Paul's an authority. Critics allow him. Here's some liberals, critics, non-Christians who agree. I love this one. Crossan says there's 4 independent sources for the burial. He doesn't even believe in the burial. But there's 4 independent sources. Jesus Seminar, 3 independent sources for the empty tomb. Crossan, 2 to 6 independent sources each for Mary Magdalene, Peter, and James. How about Kirster you can throw in there too? Disciple of Rudolf Bultmann's. It's the same thing. Jesus Seminar and Crossan, 4 to 5 independent sources for group appearances. Third fact, resurrection is proclaimed very early. Nobody waited till John was written in 65 AD. You say, well, Mark was written earlier. I know, but my point is, a lot of people think it took 60 years to unpack this. Nothing like that. How early? 1 Corinthians 15 and 7 other creeds and sermon summaries. I'll take an explanation about what sermon summaries are, but they're largely the book of Acts. They're dated between the cross and 5 years later. That is early. When a book of Buddhist teachings say every one in this book is 600 to 900 years after Buddha died, you see how important from the cross to 5 years later is. Here's some examples. My second criteria, accepted by critics. Try to put these together for you. These are skeptics, agnostics, and non-Christians. Look at the names here. If you studied New Testament, this is a who's who. And every one of these guys is critical until you get down to the other scholars list. And these are just big-name guys who also concede this. Dunn says months after the cross. Hurtado says days. Bauckham and Ware, this is not Bruce Ware, this is a New Testament scholar who's at University of Evansville, say that it's a consensus view that this material, that Paul received this material in Jerusalem no later than +5. Raymond Brown, Gerald O'Collins, the German scholar Walter Kasper, they all put the appearances back to about 30 AD. Folks, do you have any idea how radical this argument is? That we can get multi-sources back to 30 AD? Michael Martin, I told you. Michael Martin says, hey, here's the bad news. We only have one eyewitness to an appearance of Jesus. Here's the good news. We have one eyewitness appearance. Who? Paul. The Jesus Seminar, the guys who color red means yes, pink means probably, gray means probably not, and black means no way. Trick question. I asked my grad students, what color is, last of all, he was seen of me? Red. Red. What about the early statement of the creed? He appeared to Peter. Pink. And the Jesus Seminar has a footnote there. It's a pretty interesting footnote. It's only pink because it comes through Paul's mediation. If Peter had told us this, it would be red. You get it? Primary source, secondary source. And then they added a footnote, and we have to add Mary Magdalene here. This is Jesus Seminar. Red for Paul, pink for Peter, seeing Jesus. Did they really see it? No, they don't believe that. But they're saying the sources are that good. We can get back. 8 sources in the Gospels say third day, first day of the week. That means that's early language. That right after he was buried, he appeared. You know, I should have said this a long time ago. I don't have a handout for this, and I haven't seen it happen, but I've seen it happen other times I've given this lecture. Please don't take photos of this or whatever. I'm working on a 5,000-page manuscript on the resurrection of Jesus, a magnum opus. And this is actually one of my chapters. So I have a 32-page outline of evidences for these 6 facts. So I don't pass it out yet. The book will probably come out post-mortem, but it's going to take me so long to finish it. I've already written 1,300 pages, and I have 1,000 more pages for editing, so I'm up to over 2,000 pages. And seriously, I've told my current TA, who has already published a dozen articles and chapters and books, and he's a resurrection specialist. Did his master's thesis on that. He's doing his doctoral dissertation. He's so good that every other week he gives us a new topic for his dissertation. I think I'm going to do this instead. But he's so good that he can change topics and they'll just let him do whatever he wants to. He's that much up on the data. All right, I told him, Ben, if something happens to me, you get Ronnie, my former TA, who's a PhD now. You take you and Ronnie and you finish this material and you publish it and put your names on it. I already have a legacy ready to publish this material. 8 independent sources that dated early. Multiple early sources, in addition to the creeds, at least 13 other independent texts. Limited dissimilarity, that's another one. If you're not familiar with dissimilarity, I can't stop and define this, but it's one of the criteria. Multiple forms, I've already introduced that one. Look at all the embarrassment. Are you kidding me? James and his family, maybe Mary's unbelief. The disciples flee, Peter denies, the women at the cross, the women at the burial, women at the empty tomb. And Paul, who killed everybody for teaching this, they're your witnesses? Yep, and that's why they're good. Because they come from the other side. Enemy attestation and Aramaic substrata. Paul received it from other people. Majority empty tomb view again. If the tomb was emptied, we have early testimony. All right, here's the fourth one. The disciples were transformed by what they thought was a resurrection appearance of Jesus. You always have to say it that way. They were transformed by what they thought was a resurrection appearance. 8 independent, multiple sources. At least Paul is an eyewitness, so he counts separately. Other criteria. Argument 3, very early, within 5 years, that talk about their transformation. See, the early sermon summaries in Acts talk about them taking it out. Twice they tried to kill him, and what did the disciples say? We ought to obey God rather than man. That's witness to their transformations. Embarrassment, especially before the resurrection, they didn't show up. Literary forms. You know, one of my favorite verses in Acts is where they were beat up and they got whipped, and it says, they went out rejoicing that they could be witnesses of the resurrection of Jesus. It was the center of their proclamation. Tom Wright himself has 7 areas of transformation. Bob, do you remember when he was here for that debate with Dom? He had 6, and Dom added collaborative number 5. And Tom said, thank you for that, Dom. That's going to be in my next edition. I'll give you credit for it. So these are 7 things that changed when the disciples became believers. These are witnesses to transformation from Tom Wright. He's got some really good ones here that you don't find anywhere else. The apostles were willing to die, putting themselves in harm's way. We have confirmed martyrs. The big 4, Paul, John, Peter, and who did I leave out? James. We have confirmed martyrdom, first century sources for 3 of them. And a lot of people say John wasn't martyred. We have a 2nd century source for John's martyrdom. So some really early sources. The last 2 are kind of quick. I have fewer evidences for James and Paul than for the others. Multiple sources for James's unbelief, 2. Resurrection appearances. It's Dom Crossan who says we have 3 sources for resurrection appearances to James. You got to only know of one, 1 Corinthians 15:7. Read the gospel to the Hebrews. You go, what? The Gospel of the Hebrews. Pick up Darrell Bock's New Testament book on other Gospels. He dates the Gospel to the Hebrews very early, and it narrates an appearance of Jesus to his brother James. Pretty cool. Eyewitnesses, eyewitness testimony. It's very early. There's some others. Embarrassing. The unbeliever became a believer. James' martyrdom is coherent. What do you do with the James ossuary? Ben Witherington argues that if all you know is if this ossuary is authentic, Ben thinks it is, why would James's people still be claiming when they reburied his bones a year or 2 after his martyrdom, about 62 AD? Why in 63 to 64 would he still be claiming to be the brother of Jesus? Ben Witherington argues if he's not a believer, James, if he's not a believer, why would he still be bragging about Jesus if Jesus wasn't still believed to have been raised and nobody had disproven it? Great question. If the ossuary is authentic. So that's a possibility. Even the majority of skeptical scholars will concede this, and there's a list for you. Lastly, Paul. It's his own testimony. He claims to have witnessed, own testimony of his persecution, witnessed the risen Jesus very early. Hey, if I just let 1 Corinthians 15 stand, it's within 20 years. That's still very early. Multiple independent testimony. Look at the different sources for Paul. Now, it's true we don't have Roman sources for Paul, but look what we do have. Clement, Ignatius, and Polycarp are all written within 10 years of the close of the New Testament. Enemy attestation, both Jewish and Roman, people who were after Paul. Embarrassing. This is the most important thing, I think. He interviewed Peter and James twice, with John a third time, and he asked them what they believed about the gospel. And he was willing to die for it. Virtually nobody disputes this. You've got a story if you find somebody who disputes this. Here's the wrap-up. Here's the conclusion. Crucifixion of Jesus, I gave 11 arguments. And when I say 11 arguments, if I have 20 creeds, I only counted that once as one argument. Disciples' experiences, 13. Early proclamation, 12. Disciples were transformed, 10. James was converted, 8. Paul, 10. 60-something arguments for 6 facts. 2 facts, 2 conclusions, I'm done. These 6 facts are exceptionally well evidenced and are recognized as such by virtually all scholars. I'd say the minimal facts argument's built from the ground up with facts being bricks. These are our bricks. And you can get a concise, here's what the minimal facts argument does. They give you the chief facts for the resurrection of Jesus. They're the best refutations of alternate theses, and we've used nothing but the facts which critics allow. Folks, the best argument for the resurrection that we have, easily, in my opinion. You say, what happens if the critics' views change? Fine, I'm still using a very select amount of data, which are very well attested, to show the resurrection happened. And as I said last night, these are the boulders that are being removed from the atheist view, according to Angus Manouge when he reviewed a debate that I had. He said the critics have less and less place to hide. How would you like to be an unbeliever and have to make an account for this other than in supernatural terms? And although we can't answer every question right now in the New Testament, we work on things. That's called apologetics. That's called theology. We can be sure of the center. And the center is enough to get you on the yellow brick road, for which the end is the Emerald City. That's why this is so important. It's the center of our faith. It's the gospel, which is always defined as the deity, death, resurrection of Jesus.